What's up, friends? We are doing a debate breakdown. We're going to break down the new book from Jim Sterba and Richard Swinburne called Could a Good God Permit So Much Suffering? I'm going to actually interview Jim Sterba for Coffee with Philosophers at the end of this series, but the goal is to get you ready for that interview by giving you the key pieces of the debate. So in this first installment, as you can see here, we're going to look at just Sterba's argument. What are the key pieces of his argument? And specifically, he brings up moral philosophy and political philosophy in developing his new logical problem of evil. And what he does is he creates moral requirements that he thinks God must satisfy if he really is all good, all powerful, and all knowing. So it starts with this Pauline Principle that is derived from Romans 3:8. Now, it's not identical to what we find in Romans 3:8, so don't charge Sterba with taking the verse out of context. He knows it's out of context, and he's not relying on the fact that it's found in Scripture that it has gravity. He's sort of just using it as a launching off point, as some have done with the doctrine of double effect. So the Pauline Principle is, here's Romans 3:8. It says, "And why not do evil that good may come, as some people slanderously charge us with saying?" And Paul says their condemnation is just. So people are accusing Paul's theology of entailing these crazy things like, hey, if all we have to do is believe in God and believe in Jesus and his finished work on the cross, we're justified and then we get to go to heaven, then hey, we can do whatever we want in this life, right? Or like sin brings about this great good of grace. So why not just sin more so that, grace can abound and be more plentiful? Well, Paul says, no, that's not right. And their condemnation for saying such things are slanderous and it's warranted. So why not do evil that good may come? Now, here's the framing consideration that comes out of this that kind of sets up Sterba's argument. His argument begins, quote, "by considering whether there would be a justification for God's not preventing, hence permitting, the final stage of especially horrendous evil actions of wrongdoers. The stage where the wrongdoers would be imposing their evil consequences on their victims." So we can imagine that it would be wrong for God to say, intervene in people's intentions when they merely formulated the intentions to start doing a horrendous evil. And the reason that Sterba allows that is because he says, look, I agree that freedom of the will is a great good, and I agree that there's soul making. What I disagree with, and why his argument is, I won't say revolutionary, but it is new, it's novel for sure, is that he focuses on that last stage. And so he says, could a good God really allow that the final stage where the horrendous evils are actually being inflicted on the would-be recipients? Could he actually, good God, allow that to happen? Or would he be required at the stage right before they start imposing the harms that are the horrendous evil consequences of their bad actions? Would God be required to prevent that? So, or could there be a justification for God not preventing those? Could there be a greater good defense of God allowing or not permitting the occurrence of such evils? Well, let's go ahead and look at how he breaks down these goods to see if there really is a greater goods defense. He creates logically exhaustive categories: goods to which we have a right, goods to which we do not have a right, and first-order goods and second-order goods. Those are sort of exhaust the logical possibilities in that regarding goods that God could provide. So regarding goods to which we have a right, we obviously have a right to life, and we have a right to freedom from bodily harm and injury. Now, recently was watching Frozen with my kiddos. So let's imagine Sven is lost and freezing in snowy mountains. And he comes to the door of your remote cabin. You have a cabin out in the woods. You can imagine the smoke coming out of the fireplace, smokestack. And he knocks on the door. He's frozen. He's starting to go hypothermic. And if you don't let him in and give him food and shelter and warmth, he's going to die. Now, he has a right to life, and he has freedom from bodily harm. If you leave him out in exposure, we can imagine there's no one around, no other cabin around he could go to, so only you or God could prevent him from suffering the horrendous consequences of evil, namely, losing his life, dying from exposure. So then were you to not provide him with the goods of warmth, food, and shelter, that itself would be an evil. But on the flip side, actually providing him with the goods would be a way of securing his sustenance and safety and preventing that evil of the violation of his basic rights, namely him losing his right to life and freedom from bodily harm and injury in the process of losing his life due to exposure. So those are goods that he has a right to life, right to, and how you act can determine whether the consequences actually occur or not. Then we have first order goods that we have a right to. So like the freedom to not be brutally assaulted, that's a first order good. Sterba says, quote, such goods do not logically presuppose that any serious wrongdoing has occurred, or second order goods like receiving needed medical aid after having been brutally assaulted that do logically presuppose some serious wrongdoing has occurred. So there are first order goods we have a right to and second order goods. The freedom to not be brutally assaulted is a first order good, and it doesn't presuppose in order to have that right, you don't have to have been assaulted. You have that right, and it doesn't matter whether there's other serious wrongdoing has occurred or whether second order goods have been secured. Like imagine you were brutally assaulted, that first order right was violated, then you'd still have your second order right to be given life-saving medical aid. Now, out of those considerations comes the first moral evil prevention requirement. What is it? Well, let's take a look. MEPR1 is prevent rather than permit especially horrendous evil consequences of immoral actions, a good we have a right to, when, without violating anyone's rights, that can easily be done. So prevent, let's go back to Sven, prevent Sven from suffering death due to exposure, horrendous evil consequences of immoral actions. Now, the immoral action would be you not giving him food and shelter when you're the only one that could save his life, right? So you didn't give him what he needed with regard to his first order rights. And so this is saying prevent Sven from suffering death due to exposure, which is, a right he has given his basic right to life and right to freedom from bodily harm, when, without violating anyone's rights, you allowing Sven to come in and get warmed up, get food, and have shelter for the night, wouldn't violate anyone's rights, and you could easily do it. So in that case, we can imagine that you have an extra bed, you have plenty of firewood. It would be really easy for you to just let him in, stay the night, give him what he needs, and then in the morning, this applies to God too. God should prevent rather than permit those horrendous evil consequences of immoral actions. Because remember, it's only you and God that can prevent Sven from suffering those evil consequences. So in the case of God, God should do that too, right? But people die due to exposure, right? And we can imagine God could have saved them, right? He should have prevented those horrendous evil consequences. Now, second order goods we have a right to are things like they depend on the occurrence of first order harms or evils. Now, like for instance, we mentioned it earlier, imagine somebody's brutally assaulted, and then that generates a second order right that victim has to be provided life-saving medical aid. And as Sterba says, quote, given that the need we have for such goods depends on the occurrence of serious moral wrongdoing, so somebody had to seriously assault that person before they got the right to life-saving medical aid, it would be morally required for anyone who could easily do so without violating anyone's rights to prevent the consequences of that wrongdoing on which the second order goods depend. So if you could have easily stopped that person from being assaulted without violating anyone's rights, even though there's this second order good that depends on that wrongdoing having occurred, and the person has a right to that second order good, should they be, seriously injured and brutally assaulted, you still should stop the occurrence of the horrendous evil consequences, the assault, the harm, the brutal assault, if you could easily do so without violating anyone's rights. Imagine a person's about to be brutally assaulted, things are getting heavy and heated, and you pull up with a car and you could have said, hey, just get in. And the person could have got in, taken off, and never been brutally assaulted. You should do that, even though it means that person that's now in your car and not brutally assaulted wasn't given the second order good of life-saving medical aid, on which them having been brutally assaulted, depends. That second order good depends on the occurrence of the first order evil. So out of this, we get the most contentious principles. So as you will see as we progress, MEPR 2, the Moral Evil Prevention Requirement 2, becomes the principle that Swinburne takes issue with, and it becomes the main point of contention and debate in this book. So just kind of keep that in the back of your mind, if you will. So what does it say? Well, do not permit, rather than prevent, the infliction of especially horrendous evil consequences of immoral actions on their would-be victims in order to provide would-be beneficiaries with goods they morally would prefer not to have. So, what does that mean? Well, let's go back to the case of somebody about to be brutally assaulted. You could have easily told them to get in the car, to get out of there. You can see they're sort of getting worried about it. They're kind of going, hey, and you say, get in the car, let's get out of here. It says, don't allow, and then you see it about to occur, it's going to occur, and you just peel off. Okay, that would be wrong, right? So this requires you to not permit rather than prevent. So get in the car, could have easily done it. No one would have been, no one's rights violated. And the person who got in the car, if they wouldn't have preferred that you sped off and left them there to be brutally assaulted, even though that means you would have provided them with the second order good of life-saving medical attention, that they would morally prefer the goods they would prefer not to have. Like, I don't want the goods of life-saving life-saving medical aid if it means that I got to be brutally assaulted to get those goods. So I'd prefer not to have that. I'd prefer just not to be brutally assaulted in the first place. So don't allow that to happen when you could have prevented it, is what MEPR 2 says. Now, what about goods we don't have a right to? So this is going to not really become a source of contention amongst Swinburne and Sterba. So we'll just kind of briefly get it on the table for being thorough. And then basically not providing people with goods they don't have a right to is not morally evil. So such goods are also either first order goods or second order goods that you don't have a right to. that do not logically depend on serious wrongdoing, like many of the friendships we have. So like to get the great good of friendship with God, maybe there are many other ways you could have got that friendship than suffering horrendous evil consequences of immoral actions. Even though Sterba allows, perhaps you might have had to suffer significant evils in order for you to have the possibility of soul making and then friendship with God, let's say. But when it comes down to, even though you don't like have a right to friendship with certain people or right to friendship with God, it's a gift and an opportunity, but not providing, such goods to others is not going to do a moral evil. So not providing such goods to others is not morally evil. So let's just quickly get on the table. MEPR 3. Do not permit rather than prevent especially horrendous evil consequences of immoral actions in order to provide would-be recipients with goods to which they do not have a right, and like goods they don't have a right to, friendship with God, let's say, or just friendship, that do not depend on God's permission of those consequences. So like the good of soul making or freedom of the will, freedom of choice. Let's say that you getting those goods and friendship with God don't depend on you suffering horrendous evil consequences of moral wrongs. Because there's all these other ways you could have improved your soul. There's all these other ways you could have still exercised and maintained your freedom. There are all these other ways you could have become friends with God. So don't permit this bad stuff to happen to provide these recipients with goods to which they don't have a right to soul making, right to friendship with God. You don't have a right to it. When there are all these other ways of morally unobjectionable ways of providing those goods. Okay, now let's just get Sterba's argument for moral evil on the table. Here I'm borrowing from Daniel Rubio's excellent paper Against the New Logical Argument from Evil. And this was in response to Sterba's original presentation of the argument in his 2019 book. But now that he's debating Swinburne in this 2024 book, Sterba has let go of significant evils. He thought, there were various objections to him. In fact, he confronted 40 different people on this in a special editions in the journal Religions on this argument. So he did make that qualification where he got rid of, God should be preventing significant evils from occurring and horrendous evils. Now, in the new argument, it's just focused on horrendous evils. So number one, there is an all-good, all-powerful God. We'll assume that for reductio. If there was an all-good, all-powerful God, then he would conform to those principles, those requirements. 3, if God were adhering to those requirements, then necessarily the horrendous evil consequences of immoral actions would not be obtained through what would have to be his permission. Because remember, the principles say prevent God, or they're general, so they just say prevent rather than permit, and they apply to God and us. But if God were adhering to those principles, then the horrendous evil consequences of moral actions would not be obtained through what would have to be his permission, because he'd be preventing those horrendous evils from occurring. 4, we look around the world, look throughout history, horrendous evil consequences of immoral actions do occur all around us. People, just sticking with our examples, they die from exposure. People are savagely assaulted, unfortunately. They're killed, they're murdered, which, if God exists, would have to be through his permission. So God must be permitting these horrendous evils to occur, because he could stop them. And so, therefore, it's not the case there is an all-good, all-powerful God. How does this work? Well, how do we get the contradiction in order to be able to assume the opposite of what we assumed in premise 1. We assume there's a God. We got a contradiction. There is no God. Because once you have 4 is the negation of the consequent in 3. And then when you got the negation of the consequent in 3, you get the negation of the antecedent, because if there was an all-good, all-powerful God, then necessarily he would be conforming to these principles. Well, if we have the case there are these horrendous consequences, then as it says in 3 at the antecedent, it must be the case that God's not adhering to these requirements. And then, as in 2, if necessarily he'd be conforming to them, well, he's not conforming to them. We're seeing these things, these horrendous evils in the world. He's not adhering to the principles. He's not conforming to them. And so, therefore, it must not be the case the antecedent in 2 holds, namely that it's not the case that there is an all-good, all-powerful God. And we could flesh that out more, but basically, we get that there's not an all-good, all-powerful God, and there is an all-good, all-powerful God. So that is the contradiction, and that allows us to assume it's not the case that there's an all-good, all-powerful God. So this sets you up really nicely for the rest of the debate. And in fact, we're going to be going through, I'm going to set on the table some more aspects of the debate. So this is going to be really fun. If you want to see that next video, go ahead and take a look here for part 2, and I'll see you in the next time.